Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Geneviève Zubrzicki. I'm Director of the Copernicus Program in Polish Studies and the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia. And today I have the great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor Marcin Wodziński. Before I say a few words about him, I'd like to point out that this is an event that's co-sponsored with the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies and the Department of History. So thank you for co-sponsoring in this event and making possible this visit by Professor Wodziński. Professor Wodziński is professor of Jewish history and literature and chair of the Department of Jewish Studies at the University of Wrocław in Poland. His research focuses on the social history of Jews in the 19th century, the history of Jews in Silesia, Jewish material culture, and the history of Hasidism and the Haskalah. He has published over 100 articles in Polish, English, Hebrew, French, and Czech. And he has authored, edited, or co-edited more than 15 books. Of his recent publications, he tells me that he's most proud of the Historical Atlas of Hasidism. Here, a heavy, substantial book, beautifully illustrated, and you will see many of those maps in today's talk. And also Hasidism, Key Questions, published by Oxford, also in 2018. So we're especially lucky to hear him talk on the topic of Hasidism today, because he's immersed in that world, in the history of Hasidism in Poland, but also on how that religious movement has migrated to the US. And I remember last time you were here, 8 years ago already, he gave a lecture also on Hasidism, but was going to Brooklyn after that, and you were especially excited, and you were curious about which sects you would recognize in different boroughs within Brooklyn to see, you know, the different clothing style that you could trace back. So this is also lived history here in the US. As if his administrative duties and scholarship were not enough, Professor Wodziński was also one of the key historians preparing the core exhibition of Polin, the Museum of the History of Polish Jews in Warsaw. And if you haven't been in Warsaw recently and haven't seen that museum, I urge you to visit and to plan at least a full day to see the exhibit. Professor Wodziński was a recipient of too many awards for me to name here, so I'll focus on the most recent. In 2011, he received the Jan Karski and Pola Nireńska Award for his contribution to the development of Jewish studies in Poland. And in 2015, he was decorated for services rendered for Polish culture. So please join me in giving Marcin Wodziński a very warm welcome. Should I leave it here?
I might use it. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Geneviève. Better. He invited me 9 years ago, I think, or something. At that time, as Geneviève recalled, I was collecting data for Atlas, including Hasidic dress, and I hope to come to this point also. But more generally, I would like to speak about what we get from looking on a spatial aspect of Hasidism, how far it is central or maybe marginal to understanding the Hasidic movement. And first of all, I would like to start with a question, why we are here. My bold assumption is that you were not forced to come here, that is because of your interest in the topic, and why Hasidism occupies such a central place in history and in contemporary consciousness. I think this image captures it nicely. If you remember Annie Hall and Woody Allen coming to parents of Annie, and he's eating ham, saying it's delicious, and they look at him, and what they see, it's not just a Jew, it is Hasidic Jew. Why? Because Hasidism today, for many people that never heard the name of Hasidism, is embodiment of everything traditional in Jewish world. It's real Judaism. It's real, authentic Jewishness. And this is true worldwide. It is more true outside of Jewish world than within Jewish world even. And this is something that goes beyond any expectations, and I think this is something most paradoxical if we think about the marginal, mystical, ecstatic movement of Hasidism that managed to conquer consciousness of all the world, even more so after it ceased to be important movement within Judaism. I mean, at least numerically, and I hope to come to those numbers. If you think about Disney World and in Florida, an exhibition on nations of the world, you think who would represent Israelis? And it's not a men and women in uniform, in military uniforms, or halutzim. This is two Hasid and his wife under chuppah, under a marine canopy. If we know that Hasidim make 5% of Israeli society, then we understand this is misleading, but this is actually quite offensive to the vast majority of secular Jews in Israel to have those Hasidim representing them. Okay, for symmetry, I should mention also Russian case. Well-known Nikolis Circus in Moscow, which had the same show, Nations of the World, and what we have there, we have Jews presented in apes in Hasidic dress. Okay, this is fully symmetrical. And on top of this, I think best case, and it brings us closer to space and to geography, is from Poland. This is Lublin, the city of eastern Poland. That Jewish district existed outside of the city walls, next to the castle. It was totally destroyed during the Holocaust. At this territory, the new square called Plac Zamkowy was erected, and this is new pseudo-historical architecture in this area. A literary historian in Lublin several years ago suggested that in order to understand Lublin, you cannot just walk the streets of the town. You need to rise above the ground, as we see it now, and you need to look on this square. This is not just the square, and it's not by chance that it's elliptic. This is the eye of the tzaddik, as he says. Tzaddik, Jakov Yitzchak Schneerson, Horowitz, of Lublin. The seer of Lublin. The seer of Lublin is looking from below and from above. So this is something that is central to him, right? The seer of Lublin, Hasidic leader. When several years ago, Lublin announced a competition for the visual sign to commemorate 700 years of the municipal laws of the town, who won? A local graphic designer who suggested this sign entitled The Eye of the Tzaddik. So today, in Lublin, you have one Piłsudski monument, but you have hundreds of Eyes of the Tzaddik all over. It's not only behind Piłsudski. It's on every bus. It's on every bus seat. It's on every bus ticket. It's all covered with the Eye of the Tzaddik. And you know, on top of this, Lublin was the city that was proud for most of its modern history to have the non-tolerandis Judaeis, the privilege not to tolerate Jews within city walls. And now, the Eye of the Tzaddik, the Hasidic leader, is embodiment not just of Jewish history of Lublin, suburban Lublin, of all the history of this town. And I think this testifies to importance of Hasidism for our understanding of the movement beyond anything we can imagine. At the same time, I hope you agree that as far as it is widespread, it is covered with many legends and myths. As traditionally, the more widespread certain historical concepts are, the more clouded with mythologies they are. And this is something very true about Hasidism, including its messianic, mystical, esoteric nature, the Hasidim floating half a meter above the ground. And this is actually strongly rooted in Jewish scholarship. If you remember, Avraham Yoshua Heschel speaking about Judaism being religion of time and not religion of space. And all the examples that he's bringing are from Hasidic sources. So it's actually rectifying the concept that Jewishness, Judaism is not rooted in any specific place, either East European or any other. It is rooted in time. It's living in time above the ground. And this was especially convenient for historians to look that way when Jewish scholarship moved outside of Eastern Europe after the Holocaust, when the vast majority of scholars interested in Hasidism would be living in the United States or Israel, and looking on map of Poland, they would be looking for Ger, and they would never find Ger because the town is called Góra Kalwaria. There is no map that would call it Ger. So it was in some way a territorial. It was popular, it is popular until today for scholars, and not only laymen, to confuse Ukrainian Bratslav of Nachman of Bratslav with German Breslau. And if you understand one is a small town in Ukraine and the other is quite a big metropolis in modern Germany, you understand that it's totally two different contexts. In order to mix those two, you need to be totally immune to understanding the context and the connection between mystical movement of Hasidism and its spatial context. So my concept was that we should examine some of the central categories in historiography of Hasidism based on assumptions about space and Hasidism emerging from Avraham Joshua Heschel, but also from much more recent criticism. David Asaf, in his article on Hasidism in Poland or Hasidism or Polish Hasidism, he claimed there's nothing like Polish Hasidism or Ukrainian Hasidism or Hungarian Hasidism, that Hasidism could be in Hungary or in Galicia, but not of Hungary, of Galicia, because many ideas developed by Hasidic leaders in Hungary were very similar to ideas developed in Lithuania or Belarus. So what is Hungarian about those ideas? That was first. And second off, we know about Hasidim traveling across borders. We know about Polish Hasidim traveling to Belarus to visit Rebbe there. We know about Galician Hasidim coming to Poland or Hungarian Hasidim coming to Galicia. So there's no boundary. It is a territorial indeed. It's East European or pan-European phenomenon. And my question is, how far so? How far it is based on our ignorance of the nature and of the characteristics of Hasidism? How much of the travelers would cross the border? How far we can define Hasidism by their ideas and not by experiences, institutions, the way how rituals, the way how religion has been experienced by thousands and thousands of Hasidim throughout their lives in Eastern Europe. So within this criticism, I came to 5 principles of 5 that I put, which refers to studying Hasidism, but maybe more general to other issues in East European Jewish history, starting with a central problem of the time limits. 90% of research on Hasidism focuses on 10% of its initial history. It's Baal Shem Tov is the founder of Hasidism and maybe his immediate successors. And we know very little about 19th century Hasidism. Now it is changing with the first half of the 19th century, but we know virtually nothing about Hasidism in the late 19th century. We know virtually nothing about Hasidism in interwar. We know very little about Hasidism immediately after the Holocaust. We know much better about what's happening after 1960s when social scientists realized this is re-emerging phenomenon. But up to 1960s, it was generally ignored. And we know very little what were the structures, life, religion, beliefs, and on. So that's one. We need to look on Hasidism at the widest possible time span. Second one, and I think this is central to my argument, is egalitarian turn. Nearly all of the studies on Hasidism focus on the leaders. But actually, we are so much interested in Hasidism exactly because it was not only elitist but also egalitarian, because it had thousands of followers, that it managed to conquer the masses, that it is kind of contradiction in terms of having mystical and mass movement in one. So I claim that we need to look not on ideas of leaders, but we need to see how those ideas lived with people. What were the Hasidic rituals? What was experience of being Hasid for rank and file followers? And we need to get to this level, to this egalitarian level, and this changes the picture of what is connection between space and Hasidism. And then following, anti-essentialism, which emerges directly from the previous claim, is about what is Hasidism and what is not. Many people would love to say that avodah begashmiyut, the idea of worship in corporality, or the idea of union mystica, the cleaving to God, is the essence of Hasidism. But I say, to me, it is as important as telling folk tales, or maybe drinking vodka, or smoking tobacco, central to Hasidic ritual. Isn't it our bourgeois decorum, our bourgeois bias against certain forms of religious expression that we consider drinking vodka something lower than thinking of highly mystical ideas? Isn't it so, possibly? So that's my anti-essentialist approach. And then, obviously, coming from this, I claim new types of sources. If we are bound with Hasidic normative texts written by the rabbis, point number 2, presenting the word of Hasidism as it should be, not in descriptive, but in normative way, how far we understand of what was really happening within Hasidic world, how much of Hasidism we understand. So I say we need to turn to different types of sources. The wider, the better. And if we can get, among others, to quantitative sources, we can see things that are happening in wide spans, something that is not apparently visible in the text of everybody, of individual that had their narrow perspective on the world just around them, but something that is emerging from accumulation of big number of data. And here I come to something that I'm most proud with this atlas, which managed to use, I managed to use quantitative research and big data and using geographical information systems, so modern tools of doing digital humanities. And the biggest database that I collected for this atlas, and I hope I have enough time or maybe not to come to show you example of this, is 130,000 households that I recorded into the database, and I managed to map it. It gives us understanding of Hasidism that goes beyond anything we could do with a naked eye. And this is something that is central to use of digital humanities. I was speaking to graduate students today, and I'm trying to convince them they have to do digital humanities, because in 20 years from now, there'll be no humanities without digital aspect. Doesn't mean that everybody will be doing digital humanities, but it will be impossible to avoid influence of digital tools on our workshop. Whatever we do, it's very clear that with the advances of digitizing sources and with automated analytical tools available online, we'll have to use them unless we want to be relevant. I hope to present several maps that show what I was trying to do with this in the map. And doesn't mean, and I hope the atlas proves it, it doesn't mean that everything needs to be online and cheeky. It can be hardbound book that is presenting very traditional outcome, but in order to get to those maps, you need to include big data and you need to do digital humanities. And finally, new methodologies. Obviously, if you use new sources, we have to use new ways of making sense of them. And here, example number 1. I hope to discuss 2 or 3 examples as much as Genevieve allows me, okay? So my approach to geography of Hasidism was to start with the stereotypes. What we assume we know, and do we know it really? So one of very typical assumptions is Hasidic conquest of Eastern Europe. We imagine those Hasidim marching and taking, you know, all of Eastern Europe. Why did they stop where they did? Why did they go to Provence? I don't know. But they stopped on Eastern Europe only. But then, when did it happen? To which extent it happened? How can we know it? Of course, we know it from Shimon Dubnow and his monumental Toldot Hasidut. Page 7, he's saying, by 1800, Hasidim conquered all of Eastern Europe, with exception of Lithuania and Belarus. Okay, what are the sources? Okay, there are sources. All they are maskilic anti-Hasidic criticism. If we take hyperbole for reality, we are doomed in our scholarship. And that's what Dubnow did, and all we accepted. So I say, how far is it true that Hasidim ever conquered Eastern Europe? When did it happen? Where did it happen? And most of all, how can we measure it? Unfortunately, up to late 20th century, there are no membership lists for the Hasidim. So how can we get to this? If not for Hasidim, I suggested that I will count all the Hasidic leaders. And fortunately, the structure of Hasidic religiosity is so that the memory of the leader is very important, is actually central to religious activity. Commemoration of past leaders belongs to the core of Hasidic form of religion, so there are many lexicons recording all the Hasidic leaders past, up to Rashi and Maimonides, but after putting off those figures that are clearly non-Hasidic, or that are clearly legendary, or clearly they were never Hasidic leaders, this is Uriel Gelman and myself, we came with a list of 1,800 Hasidic leaders living in Eastern Europe between 1740 and 1940, 200 years. And this we divided into 5 periods, and we put all of them into that place of their activity. If somebody was active in more than one place, we discouraged the place of short activity. If there was more than 20% of his active life, we included both of those places on the map. These are technicalities that are not important, because what is important is the emergence of 5 maps, which I presented in several places already. So if you've seen them before, I apologize. I will go quickly through 5 of them. Look on the map. This is map number 1, 1740 to 1772, all of Eastern Europe. What you see is that you don't see much, which is the message. The red dots, the red squares, are the places of residence of the tzaddikim, of Hasidic leaders, and the bigger the dot, the more tzaddikim living in this place. So what you get is that Hasidic leaders live essentially in Podolia and Volhynia, southeastern part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and there are very few dots at that time only. And this is the message, I believe, we get from this period. It actually goes along everything we know so far. There's nothing innovative about this map for historiography of Hasidism. It only confirms what all scholars were claiming. The cradle of Hasidism is Podolia and Volhynia, southeast part of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Fine, it confirms the image. But now we go to second period, 1772 to 1815. Beyond the fact that it confirms Dubnow that it's growing, okay, we have also kind of territorial move. It's much more Volhynia than Podolia. It's entering Polessie, Belarus. It's entering strongly Galician territories and southern, but not northern part of central Poland. So we have the movement north and west of the centers of residence of tzaddikim. And I should mention that I use tzaddikim because I have no list of Hasidim, right? But this is based on 2 assumptions. First off, that religious leaders live where their followers live, which is generally true. And second off, that the general number, the macro number of religious leaders corresponds to the number of followers. And it's not true if we look in a micro scale, because we know about some powerful tzaddikim who create power vacuum around them. There's one powerful tzaddik, and there are no other tzaddikim in the area, because he's so powerful, he doesn't allow others to leave it. But you know, this would be true for any small place and for any district area. But if we look on East European scale, on big areas, it doesn't really matter. Because it means that if some territory is heavily populated by Hasidim, there'll be bigger number of Hasidic leaders there. So that's assumption beyond those maps. So we see them, first of all, the growing number move north and west. Third map, 1815, 1867. And you see somebody compared this map to the Rush. I don't know why. Maybe it was a biased comment. First of all, the Russian territories are increasingly less relevant for the center of Hasidic movement. The center of Hasidic movement is Galicia. And is by far Galicia. Also, in absolute numbers and in relative numbers per capita, if we calculate how many Hasidic leaders per capita live there in Galicia in this period, we come to very high numbers. We come to the number of, roughly speaking, 700 Jews per Hasidic leader. 700 male Jews, okay, 1,400, but at that time, women are institutionally excluded from Hasidism. So had 700 men per Hasidic leader. If we analyze this material further, we understand that, first of all, not all Jews were Hasidim, right? So the average number per Hasidic leader, the number of followers, which was lower, possibly much lower than 700. Also, we know that at that time, there were some very powerful Hasidic leaders who had thousands and thousands of followers, maybe tens of thousands. What was left for others? It means that an average Hasidic leader had maybe 1 million, or maybe 20, or maybe 30 followers. And now we need to rethink our image of Hasidic leadership, which is strongly informed by the leading Hasidic figures, having thousands of followers and huge political influence on their communities and on Jewish community at large. And this is maybe true for few, but it's entirely wrong for the vast majority, who had few followers, who had very little social influence. So this is also what comes from sheer numbers that the map presents. But also, as before I was saying, the move is westward, and also here it starts south. You have first Hasidic leaders appearing in Hungarian territories and Romanian territories. I'm using the term of Hungary in imperialistic sense, but this is how Hasidim would define it also. They don't speak about Romanian Transylvania or Slovakia. They say Hungary simply. So that's the terminology that I replicate here. So you see next period, first half of the 19th century, which strongly proves Dubnow was wrong. Hasidism did not stop its conquest of Eastern Europe in 1800. It did not reach any dominance. If you compare absolute and relative numbers, they are much higher at that period than they were before. And even higher in the next period, second half of the 19th century. You have the same map as before, but far stronger, representing Hasidism in Galicia, in central Poland, and developing centers in Hungary and Romania. And final map, maybe the most interesting, is the interwar period, 1914 to 1942-43, which proves to several major changes, and I would like to point to three of them, the most spectacular. First off, you see very clear influence of the revolutions, civil war, persecutions, and then Soviet anti-religious politics in Soviet Russia, and very low numbers of Hasidic leaders in Russian territories, Soviet territories. This is the area, right? You have very low number of Hasidic leaders there. Second is something that it is Hungarian and Romanian territories that have huge number and big centers of Hasidic leadership, which prove further development south, further move of Hasidic leadership south from Polish territories beyond the boundary of former Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, going down into non-Polish territories. And if you if you look at this map, you understand structure of contemporary Hasidism. If you understand that today Hungarian and Romanian courts are dominating the Hasidic world by far, and if you look on this through the lenses of the 18th or the 19th century, you don't have a clue why it is so. If you see that in the interwar period, these were exactly the territories of the fastest development of Hasidism. Actually, the only territory of development of Hasidism, because in other territories there was very significant crisis of Hasidic movement, then you understand how it is possible that contemporary Hasidism is so strongly dominated by Hungarian and Romanian courts. And final, and possibly most interesting phenomenon are metropolis. Vienna, Warsaw, Łódź. In Warsaw alone, in the interwar period, you have 23 Hasidic leaders living there permanently, and several dozen coming there for longer periods of time. And this is something that happens during First World War. And is entirely new phenomenon. This is Hushatin, a town, a mid-sized town on Galician-Russian border, which was one of the first victims of the First World War. As Ansky recorded, this town on the Galician side, right on the border, being an important Hasidic center. The synagogue was the seat for Hushatiner Rebbe from Sadagura dynasty, from Friedman dynasty. And this was a town of 700 houses, living mostly on trade, part of this trade being obviously smuggling through the border, and very prosperous commercial center. In 1915, there were 23 remaining homes in Hushatin. All others were destroyed. What you see here are rubbles. It looks like Warsaw Ghetto or something. It's unbelievable to understand the scale of destruction. What happened to Hushatiner Rebbe? He did what other Hasidic leaders in Galicia did. This is another image, which I will not discuss. What they did? They escaped to Vienna. In 1914 alone, you have like 40 Hasidic leaders from Galicia escaping to Vienna. Galicia has no Hasidic leadership anymore. In Vienna, you have tens of Hasidic leaders there. Hasidic leadership becomes metropolitan for the first time in its history. And this is very important change, and I'll come to this again. You have something similar in Warsaw. Many tzaddikim living around a bit later are coming to Warsaw. You have the same for Kiev, and you have similar phenomena happening in other areas too. Hasidic leadership becomes metropolitan, something that is so much typical of contemporary Hasidic leadership. You have very few tzaddikim who are not in the biggest towns of contemporary Jewish settlement. Another phenomenon is obviously connected to Bolshevik revolution and to anti-religious persecutions there. And this is another map that is presenting what is happening to Hasidic leaders in the Soviet zone. The huge wave of those who escaped to United States, also to the land of Israel, first concentrated in big metropolis. Why do they come to big cities in 1914, 1915? First of all, it's much safer to be there. It's much because assumption is that the military hostilities in small towns can much easier reach to average person than in big cities, which have better organization, which are better protected. There is better control of the military and of all those people who could do harm. It is also much easier to get to the followers in the big city because they also escape. So the tzaddik who was living up to the First World War in a small town have to go. Tzaddikim have to go to metropolis because Hasidim are not coming to them anymore. And this is a change that I think is informing of what we know as Hasidism today, which is the most significant change. And this is the turning point in history of Hasidism that thanks to this mapping, you can eventually understand, I believe, that contemporary Hasidism has been much more informed by the First than by the Second World War. It's true, because of the Holocaust and Second World War, there are no Hasidic centers in Eastern Europe. But Hasidism in Eastern Europe and its continuation abroad was informed mostly by the changes of the First World War and its aftermath. Let's focus on what's happening to Hasidic leadership. Up to then, virtually all Hasidic followers, Hasidic leaders live in small towns. And it's not because of their preference for fresh air. It is obviously because of religious decision to establish a court in small town, say Belz. The Belzer Rebbe living in Belz was the only reference point for the Hasidim nearby coming to Belz. You cannot go to Belz. You have to go on pilgrimage to Belz. You don't do it on travel business because you have no business in Belz. You go there for religious reasons only. You go there for religious reasons only as well as all other people coming to Belz. You are all fellow travelers for religious reason only. You come to Bełz, what do you do there when you wait for your visit to the Rebbe? You don't go to the cinema, there's no cinema. You don't go to the theater, you don't go to the coffee shop, you go to the shtibel. You spend time at the court with other pilgrims telling pious stories of the Rebbe and fully immersed in religious experience of being there for this religious purpose only. And then you visit your Rebbe, possibly at 2 a.m. at night or 4 a.m. because it had to be, that's what we know from testimonies. It was a most unusual event in your life that you are allowed to see the Rebbe. It was something to be set apart from your daily routine. It could not be as it was at home. So it was totally different than any other of your experiences. And the court there had this very clear purpose of making it aside, or making it different from your daily experiences. And now, try to imagine that tzaddikim living in big metropolis, and you walk down the street, you go to work, and you meet the Bełz Rebbe walking down the street too. You rub shoulder with him, and you say, what do you say? Sholem, sholem. What's up, Rebbe? The emotional, the religious interrelation is totally different. He's not apart. He's not separated by the religious aura around him. He's one of us. What is even more, in one building on Chłodna, you have 3 Rebbes living in the same tenement house. You can do 3 of them the same moment, actually. You go in an hour into 3 Rebbes with your kvittel, with your petition, and you can choose also. You have Hasidism a la carte, something entirely new. You come to one Rebbe, and we have testimonies saying, I come to this Rebbe because he sings nicely, but he has nothing to say. So for drasha, for the preaching, I go to another Rebbe. And yet another Rebbe, he has charismatic personality. So I go, if I want to really pray, I go to yet another one. It's decreasing level of commitment of a single Chassid to his Rebbe entirely. This is entirely new way of being in religious community. Something entirely new that emerges in the wake of the First World War. This is something that if we want to understand contemporary Hasidism, it is coming out there. But at the same time, when you have action and reaction, whatever, you can put it in Marxist categories. If you want to see on Reformation, then you have counter-Reformation. You have at the same time the growing feeling of crisis within the Hasidic world and a growing understanding that immediate and harsh steps need to be taken if we, the Hasidim, want to preserve our community. And this is the moment when Hasidic fundamentalism starts to emerge. What we know today as Hasidic fundamentalism is the phenomenon which has no 18th century roots, or not even so 19th century roots. It is emerging directly in wake of the First World War and all the changes there. Think of the major yeshivot created by those tzaddikim who turned out to be most successful at that time. They gather hundreds of young people, men only, coming to their courts, separated from their families. And they live new way of life, fully committed to their religious community, not to their families, not to the towns within which they lived. They visit their parents once a year for religious festivals, and they come to home, and they say, I will not sit at the table with my parents because I will not sit at the table with a woman, being mother and sister. It's obviously a big rift within this community also. It creates entirely new forms of religious commitment, of this humra, of religious stringencies within this world. They say, it's even bigger offense, I will not eat at the table of my father because it's not kosher enough. My Rebbe would not allow it. This is creating entirely new world of Hasidism as we know it today. And this is phenomenon that I believe, thanks to those maps, I'm bringing also other maps that support it. This is the map of Interwo Yeshivot, which is part of chapter number 7. The maps that present those developments. And I think all this we can understand only if we start with a micro analysis of what is happening with numbers of Hasidic leaders, that we see metropolization of leadership. Following this direction of the... 5 minutes?
Oh, you have plenty of time.
Okay, good. I want to continue with what we know about Hasidic leadership, because as I already hinted, we have and maybe not all, but I had it for long, the image of Hasidic leader being somebody detached from reality, being so powerful and so much in heaven that he has very little contact with the followers who obey him blindly, and he has unlimited power on what's happening in the community. And I was pointing, this is not the true, but also if we want to understand what's happening to a Hasid, what's the experience of being Hasid in the 19th or early 20th century, we need to move beyond the Hasidic court, and we need to understand what is the relation between the court and the followers. The vast majority of Hasidic followers did not live close to the Rebbe, to the Hasidic leader. They lived tens or sometimes hundreds of kilometers away. They could visit the court once or maybe twice a year, some of them twice their lifetime. So being Hasid was expressed not at court, at those rare moments of visiting the court, but were in everyday religious life in Hasidic prayer houses, Shtiblach. So what I suggested is counting Shtiblach. It's easy to say, you might argue, and I say it's easier to say than to do, but fortunately there are sources that point to, that allow for quite a nice analysis of those Shtiblach. First of all, these are Yiskobische, Jewish memorial books recording Jewish life in towns in Eastern Europe before the Holocaust, but written after the Holocaust by those people who survived or those who immigrated before the Holocaust. And we have around 800 such books. Nearly every book has a chapter on Hasidism, except for books from Lithuania. And nearly every book has a chapter on prayer sites in this place, which includes Hasidic prayer houses. And there are supplementary materials that I use for this, some of them being books of Sefer Prenumeranten, the subscriptions made by prayer houses, and they are recorded. Also Hebrew press, and also several other sources of information, including 600 interviews by language and culture class of Ashkenazi Jewry, which is amazing material. And altogether, I managed to build a database of 2,854 Hasidic prayer houses in Eastern Europe. I did not count generic Hasidic prayer houses, only those that claim allegiance to individual tzaddikim. And you might say, how do I know this list is representative? I compare it to two lists. One was made by Vladimir Levin of Hasidic prayer sites in Volhynia. He went through all variety of archival, press, and other materials, including internal Hasidic materials about prayer sites there. And my list was a bit more than 70% of his list, which I take to be quite representative. And I also compare it with the list of Alexander Hasidim, who made, Alexander is one of the Hasidic groups, and they made the list of all the Hasidic prayer sites of the Hasidim that they remember in the 1980s, that they existed before the Holocaust, and my list was again 70% of this list. So I say this is quite representative. And these maps were highly debated in Haredi web fora, and one of them was criticized that I have only 294 Hasidic prayer sites for Ger Hasidim, and they know about 400. Okay, I say it's again around 70%. It's more than 70%. I'm very happy. I'm so close to what they know, right? So I bring this image as one of the images that I reproduce in the book because I believe it has double meaning. It's one of the very rare images of interior of Hasidic prayer sites. It shows how close to other prayer sites they were, which strengthens my argument about the low social barriers between Hasidic and non-Hasidic sites. You see what's happening there. You have the small Heider group studying, as in every other prayer site in Eastern Europe, but also the fact that this picture had double exposure, that those figures are semi-transparent. I think it is very much telling for the picture taken in 1930s Eastern Europe. They are nearly not there. So this is kind of symbolic image for my understanding. So what comes out? As I told you, 2,854 prayer sites. I divided it by areas. Each of them has affiliation to individual tzaddik or dynasty or group, right? So I can break it into different groups. And from this we know that in Lithuania and Belarus, the dominant group was Lubavice, Chabad Lubavitch. Okay, this is not surprising, but we can go further and see what was the share they had and compare it to other groups. For Hungary, we can say what was the dominant group. It was Vizhnic, followed by Siget, Spinka, Kosów, Dolina, and others, right? For Kingdom of Poland, we have Gerd, Alexander, Kock, and others. This is not only giving us a hierarchy of Hasidic groups as such, kind of general picture, but more so, if we look on those data and through those data we interpret narrative sources that we know, finally we understand much of Hasidic life in Eastern Europe. Let me point to the famous conflict between Ger and Alexander Hasidim in 20th century central Poland. Everybody dealing with history of Hasidism in 20th century refers to this conflict. Nobody, including Hasidim themselves in their internal sources, can say why, when it emerged, what was the source. And you know all the stories about personal feelings of the Rebbe's or about the conflict in one community that developed into conflict of larger groups, they don't hold water. If we look at those data, we fully understand that this is actually structural conflict of two dominant groups fighting for supremacy within the same territory of central Poland. And even if we go further, we understand it, we see it even better. This is the map that I divided Eastern Europe into squares of 35 by 35 kilometers and counted number of Stiblach in every of them. And I counted what is the dominant group there and what's the second dominant group there. And what emerges is very clearly that in central Poland, you have Ger as dominating, fighting with Alexander. This is Ger, this is Alexander, right? By color. And you see how they overlap. Some districts are mixed, some districts have dominance of one, some have dominance of another. You understand the clash of those two. You see the structural reason for those clashes. And the same, if you go back, you understand about Galicia and the famous conflict of Sadogura and Sanz, that some people translate into conflict of two different versions of religiosity, but which might be true, but it has also very deep structural roots that allow us to understand what's happening on the ground. So this is another map that I wanted to present. If we go, this was chapter 5, which is central to the book. If we go into chapter 3 on dynasties, we see that those maps very closely are correlated. These are the bubbles. The size of the bubble is the number of Hasidic leaders residing in this place through generations, through 100 years. And the color is colored by the dynasty. So, for example, look on Western Galicia. I think this is paradigmatic case. You have this lilac color for Tzanz Hasidic leaders, Dynów, and the Robczyc. And you see they occupy nearly the same territory, but at the same time, this territory is clearly delineated. There are very few points when they really clash, when they are together in one community fighting for. It is very clearly divided among them. And this goes also when you go into Stiblach. Surprisingly enough, if you go into Sadagura, for example, the Sadagura is a major dynasty which has several branches. In Eastern Galicia, you have Husiatyn Stiblach only in the area of Husiatyn, northeast Galicia. You have Czortków Stiblach in all of Eastern Galicia except for the street occupied by Husiatyn. You have Bojan Stiblach in Western Galicia, but not in Eastern Galicia, and in Bukowina. It's very clearly territorial division of brothers. They divide the land among themselves, which allows us to understand how this dynastic principle really functioned in space. If we want to have more dynamic image of this development, we can, this is again chapter 3, we can see what is the sequence of development of 10 dynasties that I mapped there. You have the epicenter of Chernobyl dynasty, and you see how it is spreading into new territories. This is a very complex map that allows you to see kind of general tendency, general directions, but also you can read it deeper because those, well, I will not go into detail, but on this map, I would like to point to something that or maybe the previous one, also, that I'm very proud with this atlas, namely that atlas has 2 layers to read, and I think many of the maps manage to have it. One is wow effect layer, that you look at the map and you get the general picture, but you can read those maps also, and you can go much deeper into seeing details, that you have the general image, general message, and you have much more detailed information that you can go below. And I think this is central to success of any maps, and I hope this map or the next map or also the previous map, they testify that the cartographer and myself, we succeeded in making this. Another map, which is not so, maybe not so impressive if you look on aesthetic form, but this is a map that I think is central to our rethinking of what Hasidism really is, and this is my direct response to David Assaf, my dear friend, David Assaf. The map is the map of Sztyblach, Hasidic prayer sites, colored by their affiliation. Sztyblach, affiliated with Rebes living in central Poland, got yellow. Like yellow, like yellow, like yellow. Sztyblach, affiliated with Rebes living in Galicia, got red. Sztyblach, affiliated with Rebes living in Ukraine, got light blue, and living in Lithuania and Belarus, dark blue. Okay, so now you can say that David Assaf is true, that Hasidic Sztyblach, claiming allegiance to Rebbe in central Poland, could be as far as in Bukowina, or down there on Galician Podolian border. That's true. But at the same time, as you see, 90% of all Polish Sztyblach are within boundaries of the Kingdom of Poland, of central Poland. 85% of Galician Sztyblach are within boundaries of Galicia. So political boundaries are binding for Hasidic movement, maybe not in their ideas, but in their institutions, in their structures, in their affiliations. And what is even more interesting is, as I was telling, this is based mostly on ISKCO books, which record interwar period, 1918-1939, when those boundaries did not exist anymore. These are 19th century boundaries. But it proves that the phantom boundary of 19th century was still binding in interwar period, that Hasidism was divided by 19th century political divisions, not interwar political divisions. Also, when they immigrated to Lower East Side, they did the same. Galician and Hungarian in the eastern part, Polish and Russian in the western part. The boundaries were still holding, also on the other side of the pond. Were holding and are holding. This is chapter 9. This was chapter 6. This is chapter 9. And you have the same categories. When I ask in 30 interviews about geographical categories by which Hasidim define themselves today, and they were saying Polish, but Kraków is not Polish. Tarnów is not Polish. Heaven forfend. This is Galicia. It's still 19th century political boundaries defining Hasidism today, to the extent that this hat is Galician and not Hungarian, and we need to know it. And this is not only that Hasidim define themselves by those categories, but they also express themselves. They put it as part of their outfit. They define themselves in their dress by 19th century political and geographical categories. And so if somebody is telling that geography is not important for defining this word, visibly they don't understand what this hat is about. It says, I'm Galician, I'm part of Galician court and not of Hungarian or Polish or Lithuanian, heaven forfend. I will not do into this. As it has to go, the atlas is covering the Holocaust too. This is one of the rare images taken on Rampa in a railroad track in Auschwitz-Birkenau, shortly before the Bilke Rebbe, who is on the picture, was taken to gas chamber. So this is, in my sense, very moving and very telling story. Picture again. I'm presenting pictures from the atlas only here. And there's also a map which do not tell us much new about the Holocaust, but it shows the scale and shows the main centers of destruction of East European Hasidism, being Auschwitz mostly for Hungarian Hasidism, being Łódź, Warsaw, and Treblinka for Polish Hasidism, being ghettos in the east for Eastern territories. But fortunately, after chapter 7, about interwar and the Holocaust, there's chapter 8, which I put the title of Death and Resurrection, which might be closest to Chabad Lubavitch understanding of reality with the resurrection concept of whatever, but which I think is a nice way to understand what's happening to Hasidism today. And for this, I again ask the simplest possible question, which is, how many Hasidim there are today? And I was very surprised that we don't know it, and we don't have the clear image of demography of and geography of contemporary Hasidism. And for this, I have no time to speak about it now, so I tell only that I read Hasidic telephone directories. It was fascinating read, and I made of this the database of 130,000 Hasidic households today. So if you want a database for telemarketing around Hasidim, come to me. But also it allows us, this is the list, to see what are the centers of Hasidic life today and what are the centers of the dominance. It is only 5% of Jews in the United States, Canada, in Israel, being Hasidic, though they are biggest places. The biggest concentration is in Belgium. And surprisingly enough, Belgian Jews don't complain about Hasidic conquest of Belgium, as far as I know. And it can go much deeper, breaking into individual dynasties, individual communities, neighborhoods also. It can go by cities, it can go by dynasties, and it can go by individual groups, and on and on and on. Thank you very much for your patience, which I feel I abused. And now is the time for questions and answer. And my request, actually, name of the organizer is that the time for questions is for questions and not comments, really. I will comment, if I could. Microphones.
Yes.
Okay. Yes,
then
and I would like to encourage young. Sorry for saying so. Young people first. I was told that Michigan students are like Polish ones. That they are shy to ask after professors. So maybe younger first, and then we go to people more advanced in age. A student over there, Shahar. Okay. No, I mean you, Shahar.
Shall I start?
It seems so. There's nobody. And then Tzvi, please.
I guess in this group I'm young, so it's good. So you mentioned gender a couple of times in your presentation, and I understand that the problem, it's that it's the Hasidic movement itself really, counted the tzaddikim, the rebbes, the followers. But I wonder, with all these numbers and maps, what can we learn about the women in the Hasidic movement? If you have any insights from that, or is it really just so limited that we can only know kind of the men, the population, the shtiblach, and all that, or if we have anything?
Unfortunately, with the atlas, we know indeed very little, because it's much easier to count institutions and people affiliated with institutions than forms of unstructured connection, which was the case with women and Hasidism throughout most of its history up to early 20th century. Together with Atlas, I published another book entitled Hasidism Key Questions. Chapter number 2, immediately after definition, is entitled Women, and I discussed there the distinction between institutional exclusion and other forms of affiliation of women with Hasidism, proving that we cannot use institutional categories in the sense of we too, me too, this does not hold water. You cannot pretend that women were simply Hasidot. The term does not exist at all as such, right? This will be storks, which is non-kosher, incidentally, Hasidot. But also that we know very little about who would and who would not could be counted and taken into consideration into our research of relation between women and Hasidism. So far, there were two approaches to this issue, both in some way apologetic. One was to look for exceptional women, Hasidic leaders like Ludmila Meidel, right? Hannah Rochel Werber-Macher, a woman that became a tzaddik. But exactly for the reason that if she was so exceptional, she doesn't tell us about what was the form of affiliation of average woman to Hasidism. And we know that in order to become a semi-tzaddik, she had to cross gender boundaries. She became man, in a sense, putting towels and tefillin, praying the man way, behaving man way, and which brought opposition to her. And then the Tversky Rebbe's came and forced her to marry, right? Marrying a man was clearly the end of her role as a Hasidic leader. So this is something very significant to understand this connection. And second one would be to discuss wives and daughters of Hasidim as part of Hasidic world. But we have many proofs that, first of all, wives and daughters of Hasidim were not expected to share ideas of their husband. We have many historical proofs that they did not. Actively, they were holding very different worldviews. We know about some women that wanted their husband to turn him into Hasid, which obviously proves about commitment of the woman, but it is not from him to her. The expectation is from her to him also. So we cannot assume that wife of a tzaddik of Hasid is Hasidah. This emerges from essential conceptual problem of looking on Hasidism as a sect. We expect that all sectarians stay together, that one sectarian is married to another sectarian, and they together hold their sectarian views. But Hasidism was not a sect. It was confraternity. Husband could belong to confraternity, and wife could be indifferent to this fact, or could take pride of him being there, and she could even assist confraternity in certain activities, but it didn't make her member of this confraternity. We need to look into other unstructured ways of affiliation. Unfortunately, the Atlas does not resolve this question, and actually the chapter 2 of the other book, which I highly recommend too, only poses the question. It proves how we cannot count wives and daughters. It shows, for example, they were not admitted at Hasidim prayer houses. The Shtiblach that I mentioned, in most places, had no place for women. So you imagine a shtetl, a small town in Eastern Europe. You have Hasidic and non-Hasidic prayer houses, Hasidim going to their shtibel, and their wives and daughters going to main shul, to main synagogue. Exactly, and there was no expectation they would go to the shtibel. Actually, they were prevented from being there because there was no Ezrat Nashim. I think this is very, very important to understand it. And as I say, Atlas does not respond to those questions, but I believe I touch this issue, at least in the second book. Tzvi, then. No, Tzvi was the second, sorry.
Thanks, I'm definitely not in the young category, right. Your explanation of the dynamics and the spread after World War I thought was terrific. And it was mainly based on upheavals, boundary changes, political changes. I missed, in general, economic changes and the magnetism of economic change. But my question has to do with the pre-World War I period. You mentioned in passing the phenomenon, this is especially true, I think you referred to the Tversky dynasty emanating from Chernobyl. So you had Tversky sons in Skvira, in Chernobyl, in Tolna, etc., around the Ukraine. So this is a phenomenon of sons having to carve out their own territories, and as you later pointed out, respecting those territorial divisions. But is it only that? there's a huge literature on the diffusion of innovation, which may be applicable to your case. Aside from family dynamics, were there ideological attractions? Were there economic pulls and pushes? What explains the diffusion west and south, pre-World War I, of Hasidism?
Thank you for the questions. First off, economy is here. Map 3.2 presents connection between the size of the group and economical status of the followers. It's very interesting because it strongly contradicts deprivation theory, and it shows in very interesting interrelation between choosing big or small Hasidic groups by richer and poorer people. So it is here. It is in the atlas, and I hope you remember it after all.
Yes.
And the question that Zvi asked me was the question that one of anonymous readers asked me, who later on revealed to be Zvi Gittelman. So this is not, the question is not new to me. And my response, as before, is the following. I would love to have all responses to the question why. But I'm much more modest in my research. I want to know first what before responding why. Or maybe I'm not modest, maybe I'm bold, because I believe it's too often in scholarship we jump to why before knowing really what. So my atlas is trying to say what and then maybe how. And then from this, I hope further research can develop to tell us why it was so. And at certain points, I really do it. And there are three strengths of this atlas. I think where I have the biggest databases, and I managed to develop this historical analysis of why it was happening. So one, you are pointing to a map on expansion of Hasidism, especially with the interwar. Another one is about Shtiblach, which I hope I show in some respect why it is divided as it is at some here, for example, I go into very specific, very detailed discussion of the relation between median distance between court and shtibul and the type of religious leadership, the charismatic leadership within those. So it can go as far as this to explain. But also, my ambition within this atlas was not to look on individual cases, because the answers that you were seeking to are very true for historian, to see, looking for individual cases, for exceptional cases, for narratives of individual courts. And it's true that every individual court has its own history. Each individual dynasty has its own dynamic, and you cannot put them as kind of all-encompassing category. Still, with a micro perspective that I'm trying to provide, you see patterns, you see certain regularities that are structural, even without explaining why it is so. But also here, you have the general development line, which is connection. It's algorithmic. It's fully algorithmic that you have going along this line, connection between size and distance. But you have some groups, like Bratslav, Lubavitch, Sadagura, or Siget, that stick out, up or down. And in each of those groups, you can obviously, knowing historical evidence, tell why. But I don't think we should start with the question why before we know whether it's true or not.
Thank you very much.
So that's my general approach to this. Yeah.
It might be a naive question, but after the visit in Brooklyn or Israel, visually, I saw a lot of people in very traditional garb, and
It's
for
not
the
traditional.
Orthodox, whatever
Oh, yeah.
name you choose, and for the uninitiated eye, you cannot make a distinction. Are there any specific, I would say, sort of visual alphabet where the various groups differ from each other, and what do they mean, and on what basis are they being differentiated?
With Hasidim, it's exactly like with monastic orders in Catholicism. that it's said that it's only Pope that can differentiate them. They have very clear signs, but it's only Pope that knows all of this. And with nuns, it's even a God that doesn't comprehend it. And with Hasidism, it's very similar. That the dress is not traditional, and we don't. This is one of the biggest lacuna. If there are doctoral students still, we miss a group of 10 doctoral students interested in doing field work on contemporary Hasidic dress, and then going back to see when it started. But we know it is not 19th century. It is possible that the first signs of distinctive Hasidic dress are from maybe 1890s, but it becomes a mass phenomenon only in the interwar, again pointing to the critical importance of this moment, and fully develops post-Holocaust. And it develops to this extension that each Hasidic group has very distinctive way of dressing, with very minor differences meaningful, and type of dress for Shabbat and Yom Tovim, and different dress for weekdays, and different dress for the Rebbe's family and for laymen within this group. There's all differences. So, for example, we have two Vishnitz Bnei Brak groups living in the same neighborhood in Bnei Brak, and there are two brothers competing with each other, and they have almost the same dress, but they have this ribbon on the head, and one has the binding on the left and one has on the right. And it's critically important that you don't mix it, because you would pretend to be somebody else if you put it the opposite way around, right? So this is really complex language, dress language, very meaningful to this community.
Thanks for coming. I had a whole bunch of questions on Judaism and Hasidim, but looking at your maps, I was thinking of immigration, and like they look like modern demographic replacement, the rise of nationalism in Europe. And why is it Poland is basically the birth of modern Judaism? I think till today 75% of all Jews come from Poland, and you could see like demographic replacement in the sense where Poland decided to be very nice to Jews, and we raised in population till there were millions of us and occupied huge amounts of territory. Now I think Poland is one of the more restrictive countries. And if you thought to do a similar thing maybe in today with Europe, with Muslims, Indian, Chinese, Africans, if these maps would look almost the exact same.
No, Poland is not friendly to Muslim today, no. Poland is one of the most xenophobic countries today. I mean by
Europe
the
in
Polish
general.
regime, at least. I don't mean Polish society necessarily, though it's not great. Responding to your question, this is obviously extend beyond question about Hasidism and extend to the question of demography, why so many Jews lived in Polish Commonwealth 18th century, and this is not the space to discuss those issues, obviously. Why I present Hasidism this way, it is exactly Dafka because it developed in Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And why I'm interested in Hasidism is Dafka because this is the biggest religious movement, the most important religious movement coming from Polish lands, of all religions, not of Judaism only. And that's why it is presented as it is. Deborah had a question?
This was really wonderful. I
Thank you.
greatly enjoyed the map, including your opening thing about maps lying. But I'm really intrigued by the urban piece and the interwar years. And I loved your analogy, not an analogy, your discussion of three different tzaddikim in a single, tenement. I wondered if some of the things that you're pointing to of changes in behavior, the more fundamentalism, the chumrah, the stringencies and stuff, do they have a relationship? And I know I'm asking you not exactly where you're interested in going, but do they have a relationship with the other religious groups that are in the cities also, and the ways in which Jews are less isolated, right, when they're in the cities, even if they're in sort of Jewish sections of town, and can see sort of what others are doing.
Yeah, if you mean about interwar, I would not say so. That development, quite similar to what I was describing about Hasidism, happens in Catholicism in Poland today, right? It's much later. It's 100 years later. It is not that time. I don't see any direct analogies for this. This is what we call today churching in Catholic life in Poland today. People go to different churches for different reasons. They search for better priests. They are not committed to their own parish priests and parish because they don't like it anymore, and they can go anywhere out, right? So this is something that is happening. And the term of religion a la carte is not mine. It comes actually from sociology of religion. Grace Davy developed this term. And some others speak about religious bricolage, which is also pointing to the same phenomenon. So phenomenon is well known in other religions, happening at different times for different groups. But I don't think that Polish Catholicism in Warsaw or Łódź would experience exactly the same phenomenon as it would be for Hasidim there. At least I don't know any research on this, and I've never studied it myself. But maybe there's a point to make a comparative analysis. Jeff and Misha? Sorry, there was somebody of younger people? No? So, Jeff.
Okay. My question is about the sources that you used for all of this information. I mean, huge databases you must have had. You mentioned the Yizkerbücher for the Stieblech, and then the phone books. What about for the Tzaddikim in the 19th century? Or
it was relatively easy because there, as I was saying, Hasidim preserved this memory, and there is new, not so new wave. It's almost 100 years already of new Hasidic scholarship. So there's an attempt of making Hasidic kosher scholarship of recording this information for internal use. And fortunately, there is huge three-volume Encyclopedia LeChasidut, the Hasidic Encyclopedia by Hasidic scholar Itzhak Alfasi, who records several thousand of the bios, from which we had to choose those that are not 13th century rabbis or fully legendary figures or people who were not leaders or who did not live in Eastern Europe. So out of this, that's what I've got. And for other maps like the interwar, I collected information from ISKO books, from memoirs, from Hasidic literature, and from other sources. So this is all variety of sources that I indeed use for this. It was 12 years of research for the Atlas, so I had enough time to do it.
Yeah, it's really impressive the way you integrate different kinds of data. And my question is, were you able to integrate doctrinal, religious, theological differences into that map? For example, looking at this particular picture, you can easily see why Bratslav and Lubavitch would stick out, because they had a different way of communication. They were not as much attached to the Rebbe, to the center, as, let's say, Ger and Alexander. So is there any creative way of integrating this?
I'm discussing this a bit, but my response is that maybe you're wrong. It's not that because of different way of communication. The different way of communication emerges from different structure.
Yeah, but these things are
I mean, correlation is not causation, right? We need to understand what is first and what brings what here. And my speculation was that some courts had so different spatial structure, they had to develop different way of communicating. And here, specifically, I wanted to understand what's the distinction between those individual courts that go outside of the line, but also what is the difference between a court here and a court here? What are the differences between close charismatic leadership and distant charismatic leadership? What happens to a Hasid coming to Ger? The Ger Rebbe in the interwar time has maybe 100,000 followers. Let's say it was only third of them coming to Rosh Hashanah there. So you have still, 30, maybe 40,000 people there. What was relation of the Rebbe to the follower? He didn't know them, obviously. He knew several individual prominent Hasidim among them, and others could watch him like you watch, I don't know, baseball here. You see them from a distance, there's 40,000 people all around. There's no way for you to be close. Obviously, you need to develop other way of your associating, of your spiritual commitment to this. And this is via various substitutive forms of religiosity. So strong in Ger, for example, it is scholarship. You participate in a group that is committed to high forms of humra, of religious stringencies, hence the development of this new Kedusha forms of religious asceticism in Inger. You develop new forms of religious commitment via scholarship. In other groups, you have, like in Sadagura, you develop these forms of regal way of celebrating Rebbe, which are also substitutive to forms of individual commitment. On the other side of the spectrum, you have groups that have 2 or 3 shtiblach, and actually the Pińczewo Rebbe, who has Pińczew, a small town in central Poland, a famous Rebbe of the Finkler family, he has seven shtiblach. And he was proud of knowing all his Hasidim by name, individually, by name of all the members of their families, and knowing all the tzures, all the problem of everybody there. Doesn't mean that he was less successful in his religious mission. I don't think so. We need to understand there are different forms of religious mission. Some of them developed this kind of distant charismatic leadership by distant forms, and some others were committed to be in close relation with all their followers. And we have something that is in between, like the Bobover Rebbe in the interwar. He had only less than 1% of shtiblach of all Eastern Europe. He had less than 3% of shtiblach in Galicia. So very marginal figure. But in some districts of Western Galicia, he had 50% of shtiblach. But all they were close enough to him to come for the Shabbat, to see him. He was traveling there all the time, constantly visiting different places to be with his followers. And this is a very different way of interaction. So there's in so-called leadership studies, which is now very well developing in the administration and all those business sciences, it's called about close charismatic leadership and distant charismatic leadership. And I believe it fits here perfectly, with the exception that it's not bipolar. There's all the spectrum between those two. And as I was trying to do was the same response as to Tzvi, to see the pattern, and from the pattern to interpret differences, not the other way around.
It's time to conclude, so I want to...
Is it up? No.
Yes, no?
No.
Okay, so I think it's time to conclude. Thank you
Okay.
so much for
Thank you for
an
coming.
amazing talk.
Thanks a lot.